I've come to appreciate mainstream economists and widely conservatives for their unique grasp of history. Search it if they say it, and you'll fully appreciate the depth of knowledge available on the internet. Bob Murphy has gained a place in my heart for this very reason. I didn't know a thing about the Continental dollar when he brought it up, but I do now.
No, we just made all that up. That's not true. Money's a creature of the state, according to them. And they focus on like the colonial period and the paper money that some of the colonies issued. And then, they've been talking about the moderns. And they conveniently skip over the whole period when the Constitution first came in and the Commerce Clause explicitly forbade the states from making anything other than gold and silver coin legal tender to pay debts. Right? Why did they do that? Well, because the founding fathers had seen firsthand the ravages of paper money. Right? You may have heard the phrase "not worth a continental," right? Because the continental currency got debased during the Revolutionary War. Right? So put it to you this way: who would you trust with the printing press? Would you trust lawyers to say you guys can create as much money as you want, but just don't overdo it? Just do it for socially useful purposes. No, I wouldn't trust lawyers to do that. Would you trust bankers to do it?
The briefest dives in the internet uncovered a treasure of information on the topic. The New York Fed, for instance, turned out to be a treasure trove of historical information on financial crisis. They have an entire series on the topic. Here are the noteworthy excerpts on the Continental. As future President James Madison pointed out in the 1779 essay, the value of money was dependent on the credit of the state issuing it rather than on its quantity. The protracted war had created a massive public debt and little confidence that the nation could pay it off. But as we noted in the South Sea Bubble Post, there was soon competition to take on the national debt, this time between the states and Congress, for the right to control the debt meant the right to control the means of paying off the debt. In this case, taxation.
Explicitly forbade the states from making anything other than gold and silver coin legal tender to pay debts. Right? Why did they do that? Well, because the founding fathers had seen firsthand the ravages of paper money.
At the onset of the American Revolution, the Continental Congress recognized that to effectively execute the revolution, they would have to finance. But the means of finance available to established nations, like access to credit and taxation, weren't readily available to them. The Fed goes on to note, the Continental Congress was reluctant to rely on taxation to fund the revolution, given the role of taxes in bringing on the war in the first place. Gold and silver coins had for years been flowing to Britain for purchases, and they remained in such short supply that colonial trade was largely based on agricultural credit, as we noted in our last piece on the commodity crisis of 1772. But prior to the Revolution, some colonial states with a strong tax base, like New York and Pennsylvania, had success with paper currency. So Congress turned to the printing press as the next best option to finance the revolution and began issuing Continentals by mid-1775. Yet even here, the Fed article should be subject to some revision, which also applies to Murphy, because Professor Farley Grubb of the University of Delaware published history of this period in 2023. Here I read from a book review on the history. Economists and historians have been telling us the wrong story about continental currency for 2 centuries. Continental money did not lose its value because Congress printed too much of it. In fact, there was less of it in circulation when its value plummeted than there had been before. Most surprising of all, continental dollars weren't technically money at all. They were bonds, and they worked just fine until Congress blew it in 1779. To continue with the citation book review, which is interesting. For 230 years, Professor Grubb writes, traditional historiography has told us that the continental dollar was a fiat currency, and Congress printed and spent an excessive number of these paper dollars from 1775 through 1780, driving their value down to nothing and producing the phrase, not worth a continental. The old story is appealing in its simplicity, but also requires us to believe the Founding Fathers were, quote, either crazy, deceptive, ignorant, evil, or stupid, unquote. Moreover, the story falls apart under close examination.
And the Commerce Clause explicitly forbade the states from making anything other than gold and silver coin legal tender pay, to pay debts. Right? Why did they do that? Well, because the founding fathers had seen firsthand the ravages of paper money.
And I'll conclude with one last paragraph from the book review itself. There were no banks in colonial America, primarily because of British restrictions on chartering corporations. Since there were no banks, there were no banknotes either. Paper currency did not represent claims on deposits. In Virginia, as this reviewer happens to know, paper currency was backed by the value of tobacco in warehouses. Real money, specie, was made of precious metal and hard to come by in the colonies. Consequently, most commerce was based on barter or credit. So, with the results of a few minutes of searching on the internet and then a little more reading, we have the collection of information, historical information, we can use to contrast with the assertions Bob Murphy is making. It's rich, I guarantee it.
What this looks like.
They would use gold and silver, whereas according to your story, there's no reason anybody should be using units of account for the money. Then how come all the merchants are using gold and silver? Like, that seems kind of a weird coincidence. Whereas, our story of the origin of money can explain why they would use gold and silver. Whereas according to your story, there's no reason anybody should be using gold and silver. Okay, so I'll link to that to kind of show what's going on there and the problems with this MMT version of history to try to advance what's called the state theory of money. That, it was a wise, powerful state that invented money literally, and then,
Has it ever occurred to somebody like Bob Murphy that nations stupid enough to surrender their economic fate to a limited natural resource, more importantly, to those who control it, deserve everything they get? I find it particularly rich that people of libertarian leanings so willingly surrender their own fate to the control of others. To further expand on this topic, historically Spain created inflation in Europe because it imported enormous volumes of gold and silver pillaged from their colonies in Central and South America. They didn't debase their currency or the currency of any other nation in Europe. They simply made the raw material currency's value were based on more abundant. And other examples contemporary with Europe come from the consequences of the Black Death, which, for those lucky enough to survive the plague, inherited fabulous amounts of property and monetary worth. The population plummeted and wealth exploded. And for the survivors, when the plague finally subsided, the economy went absolutely nuts, because now you had a population that was desperately wanted to put the Black Death behind them. And the market went crazy with providing all sorts of luxury goods in response. There was ample money to finance economic activity. And in the wake of the Black Death, it prospered in a good way. Therefore, I'd like to suggest that Murphy's obsession over the quantity of money or over the basis of its value in precious metals is largely, almost entirely illusionary. It's not actually relevant at a fundamental level.
Last thing I'll say, last thing. We have a real world example of this. There was a guy who was a trained economist in World War II. I think he was British. He got captured by the Germans, and he's in a POW camp. And the Red Cross periodically would come and give the prisoners care packages, and everybody would get some cigarettes. And then in that prison society, the cigarettes became money. And him as a trained economist, he could really analyze and see what was going on. And it's a fascinating account, so I'll link that to that as well. It's a classic story in the economics literature. This guy, after the war, he wrote this up and submitted it to a journal. But it's great, like when the care packages come in, they would have chalkboards listing prices. You want a tin of ham, and you want shoelaces, and whatever you might want, and how much tobacco you had, what was the price quoted in tobacco. And he said when the care packages came in, the tobacco prices of stuff would go up, and then it would drop back down, and then some guards figured out a way to be smuggling in cigarettes or something like that, and you could see inflation. So anyway, it was a neat little thing. But
all right, so Bob's example of a scenario in which you can get rid of this coercive tax regime is to create a POW camp, apparently, where the Austrians get to be the lords over this camp, and
I don't know what to. So many remarks. The first remark I'm going to make about this example is a cautionary tale drawn from Jane Goodall's studies of chimpanzees in Africa. At one point in time, they deposited a huge pile of bananas in order to draw the chimpanzee troops they were studying to the compound. So, and with the intention of observing some of their behavior. The consequence were catastrophic. Social order, chimps' social order, completely disintegrated with this atypical bounty showing up in their midst. And it was so disruptive to the natural disposition and behavior of chimps that Goodall just, she forbade its use for good reason. They learned something from it, but not the things they were intending to study. Even better, I have a real-world example of a consumable product that became, without any central authority, a regional medium of exchange in Central America. This comes from anthropology in the study of Mayan cultures, regional cultures of Central America. Is a little background, which I think is also amusing. They were blessed with an endowment of gold and silver and other precious metals, but they didn't use any of them for currency. Instead, they used the cacao bean, which is to say they used chocolate beans as their medium of exchange. Cocoa beans have all the attributes favorable to a medium of exchange. They are small. Their small size also means that the value is reasonably fine-grained enough for the smallest of transactions. They're also very durable. They can be stored for a number of years. And of course, they are widely accepted and prized within, or were prized in communities all throughout the region. Because cocoa beans were, besides being tasty, were central to festivals and religious practice. So there was a baseline demand for this product. But even better, it gets better. This was a medium of exchange, literally grown on trees and literally destroyed in regular use. It was grown in regions just south of the Yucatan Peninsula and traded as far north as Chaco Valley. That's in the northern side of New Mexico, 1,000 kilometers away. This stuff got everywhere. I'm also a little bit curious because I'm not going to go and watch Murphy's critique at all, but I think I've had enough of it making this video. But did he ever touch on credit in the Austrian or mainstream ideas regarding credit? Because generally, because of the things that Steve King has said, it seems like they don't want to acknowledge the credit at all as playing a significant role in economic function. Conservatives as a springboard for discovery is definitely an exercise turning lemons into lemonade. Speaking of which...